Giorgia Meloni became Italy's prime minister in October 2022, leading the most right-wing government Italy had seen since the post-war era. The international press spent months framing her as a threat to democracy, to liberal values, to the European project itself. She was going to tear things apart. She was going to drag Italy toward authoritarianism. The alarmism was constant, relentless, and in many ways deeply counterproductive. Because what actually happened was more interesting and ultimately more consequential than the catastrophe her critics predicted. Meloni didn't smash things. She worked the system. She learned its pressure points. She figured out exactly how far she could push before a wall appeared, and then she pushed right up to that wall and stood there, calmly, with her arms crossed, daring Brussels to do something about it. The Albania arrangement is where this dynamic became impossible to ignore. The concept is relatively straightforward. Italy negotiated a bilateral agreement with Albania to establish processing centers on Albanian soil where migrants intercepted in the Mediterranean could be taken, have their asylum claims evaluated, and if rejected, be returned to their countries of origin. All of this happening outside of EU territory. All of this happening faster than the standard European asylum pipeline, which has become so overloaded and legally complex that cases routinely stretch across years rather than months. On the surface, it sounds like a practical solution to a real problem. Italy has one of the longest Mediterranean coastlines in Europe. It sits at the geographic center of migration routes, crossing from North Africa toward the continent. For years, governments in Rome have watched boats arrive, watched processing centers overflow, watched local municipalities buckle under pressure, and watched Brussels respond with what Italian officials describe as a combination of legal lectures and bureaucratic inertia. From Italy's perspective, the Albania plan was an ideological provocation. It was exhaustion turning into action. But here's where the Brussels problem begins. The European Union is not just a trade club. It's a legal architecture, a sophisticated, deeply interconnected web of treaties, directives, court rulings, and institutional agreements that govern everything from agricultural subsidies to fundamental rights enforcement. And one of the load-bearing columns of that architecture is asylum law. The EU's asylum framework is built on principles that, at least in theory, aren't supposed to bend depending on which government is currently in power in Rome or Budapest or Warsaw. The right to have your case assessed on European territory, the right to access legal counsel, the right to appeal. These aren't optional features that member states can toggle off when they become politically inconvenient. They're foundational commitments that the entire system treats as non-negotiable. And this is precisely why the Albania model sent alarm signals through every legal department in every European institution the moment details began emerging publicly. If you process asylum seekers in Albania, you're processing them outside EU jurisdiction. If you're outside EU jurisdiction, the standard EU fundamental rights protections don't automatically apply in the same way. If those protections don't apply in the same way, then you have potentially created a parallel system that achieves the political goal of faster removals, while technically sidestepping the legal framework that was designed to prevent exactly that kind of speed at the expense of due process. Officials in Brussels aren't stupid. They understood this immediately. And their response was swift, pointed, and ultimately revealing about the real limits of European institutional power. The warnings came first. Formal communications from the European Commission emphasizing that EU law applies to all member states equally and that externalization arrangements do not exempt governments from their fundamental rights obligations. Legal experts affiliated with EU institutions began publishing analysis questioning whether the Albania framework was compatible with the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights and established asylum directives. The European Parliament held hearings. Committees issued statements. The language got progressively more serious, and Meloni's government kept going anyway. This is the moment the situation stopped being about migration policy and started being about something much larger. Because what Rome was effectively signaling to Brussels in that sequence of events was this: we hear you, we understand your position, we disagree, and we're continuing. That kind of response is not how the system is supposed to work. The way European institutional authority has traditionally functioned is through a combination of formal legal mechanisms and informal social pressure. The formal mechanisms are things like infringement proceedings, financial penalties, and ultimately referrals to the European Court of Justice. The informal mechanisms are the ones that actually do most of the work: the expectation of compliance, the reputational cost of open defiance, the shared understanding among member state governments that pushing too hard against Brussels creates problems you'd rather not deal with. What Meloni discovered, or perhaps confirmed what she already suspected, is that the informal pressure no longer carries the weight it once did. At least not for a government with a strong domestic mandate and a political base that interprets Brussels' criticism as validation rather than warning. When your voters cheer every time the EU complains about you, the reputational cost of defiance flips into a political benefit. And that's a fundamental transformation in the incentive structure that holds European compliance together. Let's talk about enforcement for a moment, because this is where the gap between the EU's image and the EU's reality becomes most visible. The European Union is often described, especially by its critics, as a kind of superstate, an unelected bureaucratic power, imposing rules on sovereign nations against their democratic will. That description is both politically useful and operationally misleading, because the actual enforcement capacity of European institutions is far more constrained than the superstate framing implies. The EU cannot send officials to Rome to physically stop Italian border authorities from implementing a policy. It cannot freeze Italy's government operations. It cannot override an Italian parliamentary decision the way a federal government can override a state legislature. What it can do is initiate legal proceedings that move through institutional channels over months or years, potentially resulting in financial penalties or rulings that require legislative adjustment. That's meaningful pressure, but it's slow pressure. And slow pressure against a government that has already demonstrated it can absorb criticism and maintain domestic support is a very different kind of leverage than it would be against a government dependent on EU goodwill for political survival. The infringement proceeding against Italy over the Albania arrangement has been discussed, prepared, and politically calculated. But initiating it formally carries its own risks for Brussels. Because if you start a proceeding and the government in question continues its behavior anyway, while the court process unfolds over years, you haven't just failed to stop the policy. You've publicly demonstrated that your enforcement mechanism has a massive time lag problem that sophisticated national governments can exploit. And everyone is watching. Every government in Europe is watching. Poland and Hungary have been the traditional test cases for the limits of EU authority. Both governments under their current leadership have spent years fighting Brussels over rule of law concerns, judicial independence questions, and migration policy disputes. The EU has deployed its full toolkit against both: infringement proceedings, Article 7 procedures, withholding of structural funds, political isolation at the council level. The results have been, to put it diplomatically, mixed. Hungary under Viktor Orban has essentially treated EU pressure as a branding opportunity for domestic consumption. Poland's situation became so complex that it required years of negotiation and multiple government changes before any real resolution emerged. Neither case represents a clean victory for Brussels. And both cases established a template that other governments have been quietly studying. What Italy represents is something different and in some ways more destabilizing than the Polish or Hungarian situations. Because Meloni's government isn't operating from the political margins of Europe. Italy is the third largest economy in the Eurozone. It is a founding member of the European project. It sits at the heart of Mediterranean geopolitics. It holds enormous weight in European Council negotiations. When Hungary defies Brussels, the institutional response can be to treat it as an outlier, an anomaly, a cautionary tale about democratic backsliding in newer member states. When Italy does it, that framing becomes much harder to sustain. Italy defying Brussels while staying fully engaged with European institutions and maintaining its economic integration creates a category that European governance theory has struggled to account for. Not a country leaving the system like Britain did. Not a country being dragged toward the exit like the Article 7 procedures vaguely implied for Poland and Hungary, but a country staying inside the system and rewriting its relationship with the rules from within. That is a fundamentally different and arguably more powerful position than any of the previous challengers have occupied. Inside the European Parliament, the reaction to the Italy situation has split along predictable lines, but with some notable complications that deserve attention. The center-left and liberal groupings have been loudest in their criticism, demanding that the Commission take decisive action, invoking the sanctity of EU asylum law, warning about fundamental rights regressions, and the message being sent to authoritarian governments worldwide if Europe fails to uphold its own legal standards. But within the European People's Party, the largest grouping in Parliament and traditionally the institutional backbone of the center-right in European politics, the response has been noticeably more cautious. Several EP members have voiced quiet sympathy with Italy's frustrations over migration management, even while formally defending the importance of legal compliance. This matters because it means the Commission cannot count on the full institutional weight of the Parliament's dominant force when it comes to confronting Italy. Meloni's party, Fratelli d'Italia, sits in the European Conservatives and Reformists group, but her influence extends well beyond that bloc. She has cultivated relationships across the center-right that give her political cover inside the very institutions supposedly applying pressure to her government. It's a remarkably sophisticated position to have engineered, and it reflects a level of institutional awareness that her early critics consistently underestimated. There's a psychological dimension to this conflict that rarely gets discussed in the policy analysis, but is essential for understanding why it's becoming so destabilizing. European institutions depend on what you might call authority by assumption. The assumption that rules will be followed because they are the rules, that legal obligations will be respected because the cost of not respecting them is too high, that the shared European project carries enough legitimacy and mutual benefit that no government would deliberately undermine it for short-term domestic gain. That assumption is the operating system beneath the formal treaty structure. It's what makes the whole machine run without requiring constant coercive enforcement. And it only works as long as every government believes that every other government is operating under the same assumption. What happens when one government visibly decides to test whether the assumption is real? What happens is exactly what we're watching in real time. The assumption doesn't collapse immediately. The system doesn't stop functioning overnight. But a very specific kind of erosion begins. Other governments start recalculating. They watch how the defiant government is treated. They measure the gap between the rhetoric of enforcement and the reality of consequences. And quietly, in closed-door conversations that never appear in official communications, they begin adjusting their own sense of what's possible. This is how institutional authority degrades in practice. Not through dramatic rupture, but through accumulated small recalibrations, each one invisible on its own, each one incrementally shifting the landscape of what member state governments feel they can get away with. The migration question itself, separate from the institutional conflict it has generated, is also worth understanding in its full complexity. Because one of the weaknesses in the Brussels critique of Italy's approach is that the existing system has genuinely struggled to deliver workable solutions. The European Union has been debating migration policy reform for the better part of a decade. The Dublin Regulation, which forms the legal backbone of asylum responsibility allocation across member states, has been under pressure since at least 2015, when the scale of arrivals during the Syrian refugee crisis made its structural inadequacies impossible to ignore. Frontline states, Italy and Greece most prominently, have argued for years that the burden-sharing arrangements embedded in Dublin are fundamentally unfair, placing disproportionate responsibility on the countries where migrants first arrive rather than distributing it across the Union. Efforts to reform the system have repeatedly stalled due to disagreements between member states over how much responsibility each should accept. Northern and Western European governments have been resistant to mandatory redistribution schemes. Eastern European governments have been resistant to accepting asylum seekers at all. And while political negotiations have circled these issues for years, the boats kept arriving, the processing centers kept filling up, and Italian officials kept fielding complaints from coastal municipalities that felt abandoned by both Rome and Brussels simultaneously. The new pact on migration and asylum, agreed in 2024 after years of negotiation, was supposed to address some of these structural problems. But many observers, including Italian officials, have argued that it doesn't go nearly far enough in either speed, fairness of burden distribution, or practical enforcement capacity. Against that backdrop, the Albania experiment looks less like ideological mischief and more like a government deciding that waiting for the system to fix itself isn't an acceptable political option. Whether or not that justification holds up legally is a separate question. The European Court of Justice will ultimately have significant input on that. But the political logic is far harder to dismiss than Brussels officials appear willing to acknowledge publicly. There is a growing body of political opinion across Europe that is paying close attention to what's happening with Italy and drawing conclusions that should concern anyone who believes the European project in its current form is sustainable. In France, Marine Le Pen's movement has cited Italy's approach as evidence that national governments can assert control over immigration without triggering the catastrophic institutional consequences that EU defenders have long warned about. In Germany, the AfD and increasingly voices within the mainstream do have made similar observations. In Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands, governments that have moved significantly rightward on immigration over the past several years have been quietly watching Rome's playbook with interest. None of this means Europe is about to fracture. The economic interdependencies binding member states together are too deep and too consequential for dramatic disintegration to be a realistic near-term scenario. But it does mean that the political consensus underpinning European migration governance is under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. And the more that consensus fractures, the harder it becomes to maintain the legal consistency that EU institutions depend on to function effectively. The European Commission is facing a dilemma that has no clean resolution. If it moves aggressively against Italy with formal infringement proceedings and escalating legal pressure, it risks turning Meloni into a continental hero for every government and political movement that resents European institutional overreach. It risks deepening the division rather than healing it. And it risks the scenario that institutional strategists most fear, a high-profile confrontation that ends without decisive enforcement, publicly demonstrating that the Commission's bark is significantly worse than its bite. If it moves cautiously, seeking dialogue, emphasizing partnership, giving Italy room to adapt its approach gradually, it risks being perceived as capitulating to political defiance. It risks sending the signal to every other government watching that the threshold for institutional tolerance is higher than previously communicated. And it risks the equally damaging scenario where selective compliance becomes normalized because the cost of challenging it proved too high. There is no option here that doesn't carry significant risk. And that's a reflection of how much leverage the Italian government has accumulated by combining domestic political strength with a willingness to absorb external criticism without changing direction. The courts will have their say eventually. The European Court of Justice is the ultimate arbiter of EU law, and its rulings carry genuine legal weight. If the EJ rules against the Albania arrangement in terms that are specific and binding, Italy will face a genuine choice: comply or accept the legal and financial consequences of non-compliance. That is a real constraint, and it's one that even Meloni's government cannot simply ignore the way it can ignore political criticism from the parliament or cautionary statements from Commission officials. But judicial timelines operate in a different dimension than political realities. A case that reaches the ECJ today might produce a definitive ruling in 2 or 3 years. During that window, the Albania model continues operating. Domestic political dynamics in Italy continue evolving. Other governments continue observing and recalibrating. The political landscape in which any court ruling must be implemented may look significantly different from the landscape in which the case was initially filed. Law moves deliberately. Politics moves constantly. And the space between those two speeds is where power quietly changes hands. What we are watching in Europe right now is not the end of the European project. It would be both inaccurate and irresponsible to frame it that way. The EU is a resilient institution with deep structural roots, enormous economic interdependencies, and a genuine history of navigating serious crises without collapsing. But it would be equally inaccurate to pretend that what's happening is simply a routine policy dispute heading toward a routine resolution, because the dynamics at play in the Italy-Brussels confrontation are revealing something real about the current state of European authority that cannot be wished away by official statements about the importance of rule of law. The assumption of compliance that makes the EU function without constant coercive enforcement is under strain. The political incentive structure that once made defying Brussels feel costly has been partially inverted in countries where EU criticism plays as domestic validation. The gap between the speed of legal accountability and the speed of political action has become wide enough for determined governments to operate inside with relative comfort. None of this is irreversible. Institutions adapt. Political landscapes shift. Legal systems eventually produce binding outcomes. The EU has absorbed challenges before and emerged with its basic architecture intact. But the Italy situation is establishing a precedent, and precedents, once established, are extraordinarily difficult to unestablish. Because the question is no longer whether a major founding member of the European Union can openly challenge the application of EU migration law and continue anyway. Italy has already answered that question. The question now is what Europe does with the answer. And that's the question that nobody in Brussels, nobody in Rome, and nobody watching from the outside has a confident answer to right now. Because the European Union was built on the premise that shared rules, consistently applied, were the price of shared prosperity, shared security, and shared political weight in an increasingly multipolar world. The proposition was that sovereignty partially pooled is sovereignty better exercised than sovereignty held alone and constantly under pressure from larger forces. That proposition hasn't collapsed, but it's being renegotiated in real time, not in treaty negotiations or formal summits, but in the daily friction between what Brussels says must happen and what Rome decides it's actually going to do. Giorgia Meloni didn't break Europe, but she may be in the process of demonstrating that Europe's ability to hold itself together depends on a kind of voluntary political deference that can no longer be taken for granted. And once that's been demonstrated at the scale and visibility of a G7 founding member openly testing institutional limits, the map of what's politically possible inside the European Union looks different than it did before. Watch this space carefully, because what happens next in the space between Rome and Brussels won't just determine the future of Italian migration policy. It will help define what European authority actually means in the decade ahead.